Hello BookTube, Books with Banks back again with another video in my series here where I read through and analyze various scenes from Steven Erikson's books in the Malazan epic fantasy universe. Today we're looking at another scene from Forge of Darkness, book 1 in Mr. Erikson's Kharkanas trilogy. I have one other video already about a scene from this book right now, but I also have two longer videos all about two of my favorite themes in this prequel trilogy. If any of that or any other of my Malazan content might interest you, please go ahead and check out that stuff on my channel. Without further ado though, let's set up the scene. Ooh, actually, real quick, I'll say spoilers for the majority of this book of Forge of Darkness. Anyway, setting up the scene. We're looking today at a scene from the end of chapter 15, and this particular moment is from pages 581 to 588 in the Tor mass market paperback. Soldiers of Urusander's Legion have been masquerading around the countryside as bandits, and they have violently attacked, in addition to several deniers and more like lower class peoples, families and stuff. They have now attacked the home in which Enesdia and Andarist, two nobles, were to be wed, and where Enesdia and her family and a lot of her guards were waiting for Andarist and his wedding procession to arrive. Andarist and his procession, they're all in this scene. They'll be arriving to find out what has happened at the estate and what has happened to Enesdia and her family who are waiting there. All right, here we go. They had traveled through the night, breaking fast in the saddle. They continued on as the sun climbed into the sky. When it was high overhead, the procession reached the last stretch of the road before the track. Anamander, Hishtola, and Silchis were in the lead, riding abreast. Behind them rode Grip, and at his side was Captain Kelleras. There was no telling how many others had since joined the procession, highborn and their servants and guards, cooks, and their pot wagons, the tent bearers and the musicians, the poets and artists, apprentices of all sorts. Grip had seen Silchis' old wartime companion, Captain Scarabanderus, moving to take up the rear with his troop. By tradition, none had spoken since the dawn, and the solemn air accompanied them as if to protect the day's light and warmth, lest a voice shatter the peace. Grip's thoughts were on the woman riding ahead of him, and when guilt drove those thoughts back, he thought of the boy, Orphantal. There were fates within reach and those beyond reach. A wise man knew the difference, and Grip wanted to be a wise man. He welcomed this silence after the seemingly endless questions his lord had asked, seeking every detail from his recollections of the attack, the flight and the hunt and the escape that followed. Lord Anamander was never one to reveal his emotions, nor allow the extremity or depth of those feelings to tighten his throat or stilt the words he uttered, and so Grip had no sense of his master's reaction to his tale. At the end, he but thanked Grip for saving the hostage, and this drew Grip's thoughts back to the boy. Orphantal should have been accompanying this procession, riding his nag of a horse and knowing nothing of death or murder or fear or nights of weeping in the cold. By luck more than anything else, his fate had been within Grip's reach, but there was a score Grip needed to settle in that boy's name, and settle it he would. They drew within sight of the track. It was then that Grip noticed the carrion birds wheeling above their destination. Cold dread filled him, sudden as a flood. Without awaiting command or offering explanation, he kicked his horse into a canter, and then a gallop, rushing past the startled trio at the column's head. An instant later, his lord and his lord's brother were following. Grip yanked savagely to wheel his horse from the road onto the track. Ahead he saw the carriage, but no tents, no pavilion, no festive standards, and no figures awaiting them. But there were bodies lying on the sward, and a beaten retreat was marked out in dead house blades and matted grasses, straight to the house, and there, upon the steps. Behind him someone cried out, but he did not recognize the voice. The world was impossibly sharp around him, yet shaking as if jarred by repeated blows, but those sounded in his chest, and each beat was a fist against the cage of his ribs. The wound on his back bled anew. If a heart could have tears, then surely they were red. All right. So what Erikson has done here so far is introduce us along with the Rake family and their companions to the horrors and aftermath of this violent assault. And Erikson has chosen to do this through Grip Gallus's point of view. Grip, having just suffered through another ordeal and traumatic situation on his own, rescuing and getting the boy Orphantal to safety. As Grip's reflecting on making it through that situation, the next traumatic thing starts. This guy can't seem to catch a break, that sort of thing. Furthermore, now that war is sort of starting to break out, unofficial as it might be, with war and violence, there hardly is going to be any break from such traumas, and Erikson is preparing us for that, preparing characters like Grip Gallus for that. Moving on. He rode to the house and was down from his horse before it had stopped its frantic skid in the gore-flattened grasses, limping past the body of Lord Jane. Through the doorway, the splash of blood on the walls, thick as mud on the tiled floor, stumbling into the room, eyes struggling to fight the gloom, the brutal plunge from light into dark, one last fallen houseblade. No, that was the Innes hostage, Krill the Rav, his chest broken open by sword thrusts, one leg caked in blood, one hand mangled as it seemed to reach back towards the center of the house. His face was twisted and almost unrecognizable, swollen and lined as an old man's. Grip stepped past him. "No further, I beg you," said a deep voice from the shadows of the main chamber. Grip reached for his sword. "I have kin to the fallen," continued the stranger, "sadly injured, asleep, or perhaps unconscious. I dare not test the gauge between the two." Behind Grip, boots sounded at the entranceway. "I am come late to the scene," the voice said, "but not as late as you, friend." Grip realized that he had sunk down to his knees. His injured leg threatened to give way entirely, and he set a hand down to steady himself. He heard his own breathing, too harsh, too dry, writing grief and fighting horror. A dog trotted out from the shadows of one corner, where Grip could now make out huddled forms. The half-starved creature halted before him, and then sat with ears laid back. Grip frowned. He knew this dog. "Ribs," he heard himself say. "I missed you at the hold. You and Rancept both." A scrabbling sounded from the corner, and a moment later a figure staggered into view, both hands held out and groping in the air. "Who comes?" the figure shrieked. The cry echoed in the chamber, and Grip flinched. No question could sound more plaintive, no need could sound so helpless, and yet none answered. Behind Grip stood Anamander, a presence sensed but not seen, but Grip did not doubt. His lord spoke. "Kataspala." The blind man lunged towards Anamander, and only then did Grip see the dagger in Kataspala's hand. He rose swiftly and grasped hold of Kataspala's wrist and twisted hard. Another shriek rang through the room, and the knife clattered on the stones. Grip forced Kataspala to the floor and held him there as he would a raging child. Straining against the hold, Kataspala lifted his head, and blood-crusted sockets seemed to fix unerringly upon Anamander. The mouth opened and then closed, and then opened once more, like a wound. Red teeth offered up a ghastly smile. "Anamander, I have been expecting you. We all have. We have a question, you see. Just one, and we all ask it. All of us here. Anamander, where were you?" Okay, heavy stuff. In this time of so many horrors, so much grief, Kataspala, the painter, he has clearly been driven mad. And first in his grief, eyes clawed out his eyeballs. Those are those empty red sockets. Some might say that's an overreaction to seeing something terrible and never wanting to see anything ever again. I'd say it's more of a poetic continuation of how Kataspala, in his madness, is starting to confuse the line between figurative and literal, and he's confusing a little bit what's appropriate for him to express himself. An interesting idea given that he's been an artist. Anyway, Kataspala's done something I think we can all relate to. He's turned his grief around and tried to blame someone for the horrible feeling and loss. And he tries to blame and violently attack Anamander Rake. Keep this idea in mind throughout the rest of the scene. Moving on. Someone began howling at the hearthstone, a braying, hoarse howl that erupted again and again. Kataspala struggled and tried to reach for his knife on the floor. Grip dragged him back and threw him down onto the pavestones. He set the weight of one knee on the man's chest and then leaned close. "Another move like that," he said, "and I'll cut you down. Understand me, sir?" But Kataspala's mouth was gaping, as if he could not breathe. Grip drew his knee away. Still the man gaped, those horrid sockets bleeding anew, all at once. Grip understood what he was seeing. He cries, without sound, without tears. He cries. Another figure stood in the gloom, huge, brooding. Grip looked up, and his voice was a rasp. "Who is that? In the shadows. Come forth." "It is only Grisenfarl," the stranger replied, stepping closer. Though tears glistened in his red beard, he somehow smiled. "I am known as the Protector." Grip stared up at the giant, unable to speak. Shattered by that smile, he tore his gaze away and looked across to his lord. Anamander stood with his head turned, his eyes fixed upon the prostrate form of Andarist. He was motionless, as if carved from onyx. His brother's howls continued unabated. Silchus appeared, halted a half-dozen paces back from the hearthstone. He stared down at Anesdia's body, lying motionless and ruined beside Andarist. Behind him came others. None spoke. Beneath Grip, Kataspala continued his silent, horrifying weeping. The fingers of his right hand made small scribing patterns against the floor. Shudders rippled through the man, as if fevers burned in his skull. Okay, just breaking really quickly to say here, okay, now all of the players have arrived in the same room. We know who everyone is, and now a significant conversation or slash debate is about to happen. Here we go. When Anamander drew the sword from the scabbard at his side, Andarist lifted his head, his howls cutting off abruptly, although the echo of the last lingered for what seemed an impossibly long time. Anamander walked towards Andarist, his strides uneven, as if he was drunk, and halted near the hearthstone. Before he could speak, Andarist shook his head and said, "I will name it." Anamander stiffened at his brother's cold pronouncement. Silchus spoke. "Andarist, the weapon is not yours. The wound is mine, and I will name it." Beneath Grip, Kataspala cackled softly and held his head cocked to better hear the words being spoken now by these three brothers. Anamander said, "And if I name my future, Andarist, will you doubt me? Will you challenge me?" "Not now," whispered Silchus to Andarist. "Not on this day, I beg you." "Where were you?" Kataspala asked again in a broken voice. "Blind in the darkness. I warned you all, but you refused to heed me. I warned you. Now see what she has made." On his knees, Andarist moved up alongside Anesdia's body with tenderness that was aching to witness. He gathered her up in his arms and held her head against his breast. He did all this without once breaking his gaze upon Anamander. "I will name it," he said. "This sword is drawn, brother. As you can see, I am awakened to vengeance, and so shall this weapon be named Vengeance." But Andarist shook his head, one hand stroking Anesdia's hair. "Anger blinds you, Anamander. You take hold of vengeance and you believe it to be pure. Remember Henarald's words." "The road is true," Anamander said. "No," said Andarist, and tears glistened in streams down his cheeks. "Vengeance deceives. When you see its road to be narrow, it is in truth wide. When you see it wide, the path is less than a thread. Name your sword Vengeance, brother, and it will ever claim the wrong blood. In this blade's wake I see the death of 1,000 innocents." He paused, looked round woodenly, as if not even seeing what met his eyes. "Who is to blame for this? The slayers who came to this house? Those who commanded them? The lust of battle itself? Or was it a father's cruelty to his child 12 years ago? A stolen meal? A dead mother? An old wound? An imagined one? Vengeance, Anamander, is the slayer of righteousness." So, here we get to the beginning of this debate. Is vengeance an appropriate answer to such an atrocity and to such grief? Or, as Andarist seems to believe, is vengeance only an excuse for those in pain to, in turn, lash out at whoever they consider their enemies and who they consider responsible? Wouldn't it be nice if we could always know 100% who was responsible for a crime and who was responsible for our grief? If we could, then maybe we could have a just or a righteous response, but things are never so simple. We can also start to see here now how Kataspala's reaction to blame and try to attack Rake a few pages ago is similar to how Rake is now wanting to name his sword Vengeance. Moving on. "I need not reach to a childhood's tragedy, brother, to know who has made himself my enemy on this day." "Then you shall fail," Andarist said. "Vengeance is not pure, it rewards with a bitter aftertaste. It is a thirst that cannot be assuaged. Leave me to name your sword, Anamander, I beg you." "Brother, leave me to name it." "Then do so," Anamander said. Grief. The word hung forlorn in the chamber, amidst breaths drawn and then surrendered, and it stung like smoke. "Andarist, take this name from me, Anamander. Please, take it." It has no strength, no will. Grief upon iron, it is rust. In fire, it is ash. In life, it is death. Brother, I will take nothing from that word. Andarist looked up with bleak eyes. You will take my grief, Anamander, or never again shall I look upon you, or call you brother, or know your blood as mine own. Anamander sheathed his sword. Then you shall but hear the tales of the justice I will mete out in your name, and the vengeance I will exact, which I here swear upon the still body of your beloved, and upon her father's cold flesh. Andarist lowered his head as if his brother had just vanished before his eyes, and Grip Gallus knew that he would not look up, not until Anamander had departed this place. Okay, so let's pause again just to think about the difference between Andarist and Anamander's reactions to this pain. Rake, on one hand, is a man of action, and Andarist, on the other, is a bit more patient and wise. Rake has, so far throughout this book, he's been denied by Mother Dark in his efforts to defend her honor and take a violent approach of any kind there, and here he sees a pain and grief so much closer to home, and now he sort of finally has more of an excuse to act out some type of vengeance. But I think he is just so darn frustrated because Andarist, his brother, is basically forbidding him from doing so. Andarist is in way too much pain to want to inflict any more damage or pain on anyone, no matter how just the cause. And Rake is in too much pain to want to really sit still anymore. And so Erikson has created this impassable conflict between these brothers that just really breaks your heart. People should be around each other and help one another through the grieving process, but as Erikson has so astutely pointed out in other books, grieving is in truth a much more lonely process and a much more of an isolating process than that. And people can grieve in totally contradictory ways, and that can cause more and more conflict building on top of what's already a tragic moment. Moving on. Silchus stepped into the chamber, and as Anamander marched past him, he reached out and spun his brother round. "Do not do this," he cried. "Take his grief, Anamander, upon your blade. Take it. And so dull every edge, Silchus? I think not. Will you leave him to bear it alone? I am dead in his eyes," Anamander said in a cold tone, pulling free. "Let him mourn us both." Beneath Grip Gallus, Kataspala laughed softly. "I have him now," he said in a hiss. "His portrait! I have him, at last I have him. His portrait, and I have him. On the skin, I have him. Wait and see." And the mouth beneath those empty sockets twisted with joy, and with the fingers of his hand he began painting the air. From the hearthstone Andarist wept, and then words spilled from him, loose and filled with despair. "Will no one share my grief? Will no one mourn with me?" Silchus said, "I will bring him back." But Andarist shook his head. "I am blind to him, Silchus. Choose now." "I will bring him back." "Then go," whispered Andarist. Silchus rushed from the chamber. And I think Silchus here in the scene is sort of an indecisive figure on this vengeance or grief debate. Perhaps he's not as personally affected by the tragedy, or perhaps he's just a little bit too practical and realizes he at least needs to try to be the glue that holds the family together. Also, let's take a moment to admire the sort of literal metaphor. Andarist is blinded by grief to the vengeance and ambitions of his brother, Anamander. And earlier, or already, Kataspala has literally blinded himself in grief. Beautiful, powerful stuff. Finishing up the scene now. Kataspala struggled free of Grip, pushing with his feet. He rose, tottering, fingers cutting at the air. "Listen to them," he shrieked. "Who sees here? Not them, only me. Kataspala, who has no eyes, is the only one who can see." "Kataspala," called Andarist, "I hold your sister in my arms. Join me here." "You weep alone," the man replied in a voice empty of all sympathy. "She was never for you. You made for her this path with your pathetic words of love and adoration, and she walked it to her death. Look on me, O forgotten son of darkness, for I am your child, your malformed, twisted spawn, and these halls see your future, if you dare." "Enough," growled Grip, advancing on the fool. "Your mind is broken, and now all you do is lash out." Kataspala spun to face him, grinning. "I am not the one wielding vengeance, am I? Run to your master, you groveling cur of a man. There's more blood to spill." Grip struck him, his blow sending the artist sprawling. He moved forward again. "Stop!" He looked over to see Hishtola and stepped back. "My pardon, milady. I am dragged across a jagged edge. It cuts upon all sides." Kataspala was lying on the floor, quietly laughing and muttering under his breath. Hishtola walked up to Andarist. "Do you see my tears?" she asked him, kneeling and resting a hand against the side of his face. "You do not mourn alone, Andarist." And she took then the last brother into her arms. Okay, so I think at the end here we see someone, Hishtola, a friend of the family, offering really the only appropriate answer between Anomander's rushing off and Kataspala's mad ravings. No one has really done anything to make the situation better. Hishtola might not even be doing that now, but at least she isn't adding to the tragedy anymore. At least she isn't making things worse. And the response to tragedy can be a bit of a snowball effect if no one knows how to respond and everyone only sees the differences in all of their responses. When we're so emotionally vulnerable like this, I think we can accidentally do so much more to hurt each other, even when others are just as vulnerable as us. I think as much as Erikson's work focuses on the place and role of compassion in society, this scene demonstrates how difficult it can be to be compassionate when everyone is forced to share in one tragic moment, one tragedy. Everyone will often turn inwards and thinks only about how they want to address their own grief, as opposed to thinking about how to address or try to understand anyone else's. Anyway, that was a very heavy scene, one of my favorite moments from Forge of Darkness. But thank you again, as always, for watching. I think Erikson continues to outdo himself in this prequel series. I'll have one more video coming up on Forge of Darkness, and then 3 more planned for Fall of Light. So if you haven't already, please like and subscribe and share with your friends. Thank you so much for watching. Have a nice day. Bye.